This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is wolves as a keystone species. I have two experts on the subject, and we'll be talking about wolves and their future. Gary Skiba and Chris Smith are my guests. We will be talking about wolves, their past and their future with the human species. As I like to do, I want to give both of my guests a few moments to introduce themselves, who they are, what their relation to the subject is, and so forth. So in the upper left is Gary Skiba. He works for the San Juan Citizens Alliance. Gary, if you could give a little background about who you are, what the San Juan Citizens Alliance is, and how you got interested in wolves.
Sure, thanks, Dan. I started off in wildlife, from as a child, just hunting and fishing with my father. Eventually discovered the field of wildlife management and went to the University of New Hampshire to get my bachelor's degree, and then to Colorado State University for my master's. I worked on bighorn sheep. That's why they're in the background here. And I joined the Colorado Division of Wildlife, which has since merged with the Parks the Parks Agency in Colorado to become Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And during my stint there, one of the things that I did was I was the biological and technical lead on the wolf management plan that we put together back in 2004. So that's where my interest in wolves really got started. And I retired from the agency in 2010. I've done a lot of things in between, but mostly wildlife related. And I currently work for the San Juan Citizens Alliance, which is a regional environmental group based out of Durango. And our mantra is that we're focused on clean air, water, and healthy wildlife. And that's what we do. So that's pretty much my story.
Before I go to Chris, I just wanted to ask, because I know I tried contacting probably a dozen or so people, and a lot of them will work for the national parks, and they needed to get permission from the government to speak on wolves or something. I found it to be a bit odd. Is that something that you encounter, sort of this kind of bureaucracy? Does it serve a purpose, or?
Well, that does happen regularly. I mean, wolves are just very political, in spite of anything else. I mean, they have a lot of biological issues that are associated with it, but there are a lot of political issues. And so those agencies, including the state wildlife agencies, tend to be very, very careful about what they say and who they talk to, and just how they communicate on wolves. It's just a very sensitive topic.
Okay. Chris Smith, if you could give a little background about the Wild Earth Guardians and yourself regarding wolves.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me on, Dan. Wild Earth Guardians is a Western American organization that works to protect and restore wildlife, wild rivers, wild places, and the health of the American West. I've been with Wild Earth Guardians for about 6 years. I'm our Southwest wildlife advocate. And I came to this point from a different pathway than Gary. I don't have any kind of formal scientific training. I became an advocate for the natural world through community organizing, and I studied kind of ethics and philosophy vis-a-vis the environment at University of Chicago Divinity School. So I think more in terms of philosophy and history and humans' current and future relationship to the natural world. And wolves, I think, are one of the great test cases of that relationship, because wolves, as Gary mentioned, are, despite them not having any political attributes, they're probably one of the most politically contentious issues in the American West, and certainly the most high-profile political animal in the American West. And humans' ability to coexist with wolves as they come back from the brink, I think, really speaks volumes to how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the rest of the natural world, and ultimately how we choose to survive on this planet, and for how long.
Well, Chris, I want to ask both you and Gary. I'd mentioned in my intro the term Keystone, and in doing this is the third show I've done. I did a show on bison and beavers, and this is a term that seems to be rather new, at least to the general public, to lay people like me. Chris, can you define what a keystone species is and what a wolf is in your view?
I will do my best, and I'm sure Gary will weigh in with some corrections. But to me, a keystone species is one that both signals and impacts the health of an ecosystem in that it has a more widespread and deeper impact than many other species within that system. So a keystone species has effects on all of the other plants and animals and even natural processes within that system. And, you know, in this case, wolves are an apex predator, so their primary effect is through trophic cascades or through the food web. So that is my impression of what a keystone species is. And wolves are, you know, among the most important keystone species in Western ecosystems, again, through that food web impact. They move ungulates around the landscape, and in doing so, they can promote plant life and biodiversity and even healthier watersheds than we currently have.
Now, you just used the term apex predator. I know, for example, here in North America, that also is applied to grizzly bears and farther north to polar bears. But an apex predator is not necessarily a keystone species and vice versa. Is that correct?
I think most apex predators have a lot of impact on the systems in which they live. Whether or not they're all keystone species, I'll have to acquiesce to Gary on that. But I think a lot of apex predators do fill that type of role. And I would add lions, and you mentioned bears, you know, jaguars in the American Southwest and Central America. Those are some of the keystone species that I think of.
Gary, same question towards you about wolves as a keystone species. And is there a difference between apex predators and keystone species?
Yeah, and Chris did a great job as far as answering the question. And I think just to add a couple of nuances to it, most apex predators, as Chris suggested, are keystone species in the sense that, you know, a keystone species, one of the parts of the definition of that technically is that they have an impact that is larger than expected based on their numbers in the system. So, you know, if you look at a species like a wolf, they have a much greater impact than you would think by having, you know, 1,000 wolves. That's much more of an impact that occurs both to their prey species and also to the environment as a result of the impacts on their prey species and on other predators. So they're having that outsized impact. That's part of the concept, and it's greater than expected. And so, you know, some of the other keystone species that I don't think Chris mentioned are prairie dogs are considered a keystone species because they feed so many other species. Their towns create habitat for lots of other species. So their impact is beyond what you would expect just based on their numerical abundance. Another one is beavers. You know, beavers, because of the way that they manage water and you know, part of that is too, and while I'm thinking about beavers is we have this tendency, and people have called it ecological amnesia, where we no longer really, we see the systems that are out there now or the conditions that are out there now, and we think those are normal, so to speak. And they're not. I mean, not compared to what was here before Europeans got here and started to muck around in our systems. So beavers were everywhere. I mean, they were just like everywhere. And yeah, at one time, the estimate is that every half mile of stream had a beaver dam on it. So there's a beaver dam for every half mile. And if you look at that and look at what we have now, we're nowhere near that. And just thinking about the impacts of impounding all that water, what that did to the water tables, what that did to vegetation, how that affected fires moving through the landscape, you know, they were having a major, major impact. In that sense, we're a keystone species. So I think most apex predators are keystone species if they're abundant enough to actually effectively affect their prey populations. If they're not abundant enough to do it, they're not, because they can't function in the way that they do. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about wolves and how they developed and how they, you know, sort of grew into their role over the millennia as a keystone species. And then I want to talk about the relationship between wolves and mankind, both Native Americans, Europeans around the world, and also the sort of mythic connotations that we get from a wolf. So since you're the more science end, let me ask you, Gary, then. Wolves, you know, famously there was the dire wolf, and we look back at the megafauna of the last glacial period. You see a lot of bears, wolves hunting down woolly mammoths and stuff. So how did the modern wolf, as opposed to the dire wolf or any other predecessors, how did that emerge in Europe, and did it emerge the same way in the Americas? And how are they different, wolves different from assorted other dog-like creatures, the coyotes, the wild dogs, dingoes, and such?
There's a lot in there, Dan. So
Well,
a lot that we could talk about. But wolves evolved in the old world and then migrated into North America across the Bering Land Bridge.
Okay.
So they, that was the evolutionary history in that sense, as far as where they came from. So it is the same species, and today it is the same species in Spain as it is in central Mexico. Those are all Canis lupus. There are a number of subspecies of that, but technically speaking, all the same species. They can all interbreed freely. If you brought a wolf from Spain to Montana, they would do fine as far as breeding with the other wolves and contributing their genetic material. But it would be a little different. But they would be able to breed and act as wolves here, just as they do in Europe. So they are all the same species, which is one important thing to understand. As far as the differences between wolves and other members of the canid family, they are the biggest of the canids, and they are the ones that are most social in the sense of living socially and also hunting socially. So that is one difference. And there are other canids that do hunt socially, and even coyotes do sometimes. So there's a lot of flexibility in the behavior of the canids. So they sometimes will act like wolves, and sometimes they'll act like single individual animals in their hunting strategies. So there's a lot, like I say, just a lot of flexibility there, and a broad range of how they do it. But wolves are almost always social. You'll hear about lone wolves, and those tend to be animals that, for one reason or another, are no longer able to function in a pack, either because there isn't a pack. Famously, some of the last animals in Colorado, at least, were individual wolves because there were no packs left. And so they had to function separately and individually. And they can't do the same things they can as a pack. I mean, we have 8 animals attacking an elk. That's far different than one animal trying to attack an elk. So there are issues there with the standard, I guess you could call it, function of wolves. They function in a pack in a social setting.
So let me ask about the passage across Beringia, because we know that Native Americans came, from 12 to 30,000 years ago. That there's a much wider spread than what once thought. Know that a lot of the brown bears came over from Eurasia into America once Beringia, the ice opened up. I know, having looked at it, that a lot of the grizzly bears, it took them 3 or 4 times to get a foothold in America because they were always sort of repelled by the short-faced bears that were native to America. Did wolves come along with human beings? Were they following the trail of human beings because they knew human beings were wasteful and they could scavenge, or did they make it by themselves? And when did they come?
Yeah, I'm sure that process was just happened to be a parallel process with humans. It wasn't dependent on humans at all. What it was dependent on was their prey. Yeah. If the prey was moving across the land bridge, the wolves were following them at some level. So, and I don't mean literally following along footstep by footstep, but that they were moving into areas that had sufficient prey, establishing new packs and moving that way. So it wasn't like they decided to take a stroll across the land bridge. It's they were following their prey along the way.
So if wolves, if wolves Canis lupus at least 10, 20,000 years old in a modern iteration, they seem to have been quite stable, yet we know that modern dogs have come from either Canis lupus or their progenitors themselves. It seems very interesting that human beings could get this wild selected variety of domesticated dogs, but wolves in the wild retain their basic natal form. Is there some kind of, I don't know, oddity to that, or that they didn't evolve, and that you didn't get separate species of wolves in the Americas and the old world?
Chris, do you want to talk? You're not talking. If you
Oh,
want to say something, feel free, because I just feel like I'm rambling on. So if you'd like to jump in, feel free. Or if you want me to, I will. I just want to give you that opportunity.
oh, I appreciate it, Gary. You hear me talk too often. But you are the expert on this specific stuff. My suspicion, Dan, is intentional human breeding has a lot to do with the difference between the spectrums of the two animals. But I'm sure Gary has some answers that are a little more rooted in science and history.
Yeah, one thing I would say, Dan, is you said something along the lines of wolves have been fairly stable, and I guess fairly stable is fair. But if you look at the fact that we have subspecies that evolved in North America, and the Mexican gray wolf, which is a subspecies. A lot of people think the Mexican wolf is a different species. It is not. It's a subspecies. And they are distinctive in some ways, both genetically and in some minor appearance factors. So, you can see, if somebody shows you a photo of a wolf, a lot of times you can say, oh, that's a Mexican wolf, just based on coloration, and especially if you get size, because they're a little bit smaller, but they're the same species again. But there has been differentiation in gray wolves in North America. At one time, there were 24 subspecies identified in North America. Now there are 4 or 5, depending on how you play the game. But so that's just taxonomists deciding what their view of the world is overall. But the point is, they did indeed diversify after they got to North America, and to the extent that they can function normally, they're continuing to diversify. One of the factors we can think of is we know that climate change is a real thing, and as that happens, wolves are going to adapt to that in some way. Their prey is going to adapt. They're going to adapt. Vegetation is going to adapt. So wolves will be adapting along with it. So they are. And as far as the existence of dogs, I mean, you can see what we've done there. As Chris said, that was due entirely to human selection. And the first wolves, who knows? I mean, wolves are very curious about people. Wild wolves still are. And so there's no question there was an interaction that could occur there. And eventually somebody picked up a wolf puppy and took it home, and we started to have dogs.
I would just to reemphasize what Gary was alluding to there, humans are very, very good at categorizing things. That's most of what our brains do. And so we do that, from a biological perspective, taxonomically or genetically, or even nowadays we have legal prompts that make us categorize different species in different ways. And the biological reality is that, there was likely a spectrum of wolves from, all the way down from Central America up to Canada. And, before we started coming along and putting lines and names and categories, their genetic makeup and their taxonomical makeup was a spectrum, a smooth thing, not some kind of breakage. And I think that, just that, again, that human instinct to categorize, sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's best to leave it behind.
So let me ask you, Chris, and then I'll go to Gary. Does the historical archaeological record suggest about the human-wolf interaction, say, in Europe, in Eurasia, and in North America? Were the peoples at the various times, were they coexisting with wolves? Were there, we know of the big bad wolf in the human psyche. How did each of these different peoples deal with wolves? Was it the same? Was it different? Did it change over time? I'm talking pre-Columbian. Once we get to Columbus, we'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, in as much as I have a lot of knowledge, which I doubt, it's mostly of the last 200, 300, 400 years. So I would actually kick that to Gary if he's got an answer.
Gary?
Yeah, I don't have a direct answer because I don't know enough about all of the native peoples in North America, for example. I do know that most of them, the ones that I know of, treated the wolf as sort of a brother species, or in some cases, like, for example, the Southern Ute tribe, which is here in Colorado now, it's part of their creation story. the wolves are. So they generally were viewed positively. That's not the case anymore, with the tribes necessarily, but that was historically how they viewed it, as they did most animals. There were a few animals that were viewed as negatively. I mean, one of the classics is in the Navajo culture, owls are considered a bad omen. They don't talk about owls. They don't like to see owls. If they see an owl, they think it's a negative thing. So there are some species that are like that, but to my knowledge about wolves, they have always been, either neutral or positive. Neutral in the sense of they're part of the system we live in, or positive in the sense that they're actually a companion or brother or a related animal.
Before we get to sort of the last few centuries, pre-Columbian Europeans coming to the Americas, let's talk a little bit about how Europeans viewed wolves, because you mentioned Native Americans having a mostly positive cultural view towards them. But clearly, it seems to me that European culture, I mentioned the big bad wolf, even a name, one of the most famous figures in literature is Beowulf, which means war wolf. Clearly, wolves in the European psyche were both admired and greatly feared. To what degree do you think that has affected the treatment of wolves later on as Europeans came over to the Americas, or am I off base with my initial assessment, Chris?
Again, I'll have to let Gary weigh in on the details if he can, but I think what the takeaway for me is that we see throughout history and throughout cultures is a special relationship. And by that, I mean, whether it's negative, neutral, or positive, wolves, I think, occupy an outsized place in the human imagination. And I think that comes from some of our shared social characteristics, shared hunting strategies and survival strategies, and then also the companionship that, nowadays we see with domesticated dogs. And so, again, my feeling is that wolves occupying that special place in the historical imagination of people impacts and leads us to this place today where wolves are this, an icon in the culture wars, essentially. So the nuances I'll leave to Gary, but I think that that's an important thread to track throughout.
Well, Gary, let me ask you, why is it the big bad wolf and not the more alliterative big bad bear? Is it because wolves are pack animals and bears are solitary? Is it because it's harder to outrun a whole pack of predators rather than a single possible giant killer? And how did these takes on both the bear and the wolf affect how they were treated when Europeans came to the New World?
Well, again, I can't claim to be an expert on all the history there, but I can tell you my thoughts on it. And Chris, I think, hit a lot of it on the head. But one of the things to recognize is that wolves in Europe in particular and Asia are much more subject to rabies than they have been in the United States or in North America. So a lot of the stories that you hear about wolves attacking people in Europe and Asia did happen. They are real. And but a lot of those wolves were rabid. And so as far as we know, in North America, there have only been 2 cases where healthy wolves have attacked humans. And one of those is even somewhat questionable. But rabid wolves, on the other hand, they have rabies. It's hard to say what they would do. They're definitely out of control. But so that is one big difference. And I think that's why wolves had that reputation that they gained in Europe and Asia more so than they did here. But one thing that you kind of touched on, Dan, was the idea that Europeans got here, and what they did is they imported their philosophy, their ideas about wolves directly with them. And so their whole approach was to get rid of wolves from the very start. And I would highly recommend a book that is fairly new. Dan Flores wrote a book called Wild New World. And he has a wonderful account of how wolves, and it's much broader than wolves. It's about wolves and the wildlife in North America in particular. And his basic theme is that capitalism drove what happened to our wildlife in North America. So, we have this myth, he calls it a myth, about, that we wiped out bison to take away the food source for Native Americans, when in fact, his view is that it was just people out there trying to make money, period. And that's what really caused the decline of the bison. And similarly, we wiped out passenger pigeons in the same way. I mean, it's just even hard to imagine what the world was like, or what North America was like, when passenger pigeons were here in the numbers that they were. Billions of birds. And they just affected their systems in so many ways. And that we wiped them out. We killed them, and we killed them for food primarily. We just shot passenger pigeons. They went to markets in big cities. And so Dan does a really good job of addressing that situation as well. But back to the wolves, that was his point, is that we imported the philosophy of Europeans towards wolves when we got here to North America. And, the only good wolf was a dead wolf at that point, and we did a damn good job of getting rid of them.
Well, now, but I have to say, Europe, there aren't any wolves in Europe left now, is there? Are there?
Oh, yes, there are.
There are?
Yeah, there are wolves across all of Europe, and depending on where you are, there's some places that have much higher densities of wolves. Israel, I know, has higher densities of wolves than we'll ever see in North America. And some of especially the Eastern European countries, but they do range all the way from Spain across Europe. And it varies by country how many wolves there are, the densities.
Did they decline like they did here in the Americas and then rebound with government assistance or being protected?
There was some of that. And again, it depends on it. You're talking about a lot of different countries. So a lot of different things happened over the years. Some places never really went after their wolves the way we do. And that's an important point. I think it's very instructive to think about cattle and sheep producers in Eastern Europe, particularly, and how they live with those animals. And in some cases, they have the same attitudes that some people in North America have towards wolves, that the only good wolf is a dead wolf, but most of them have learned to live with them. That's why we're looking at, for example, the guard dogs that are available in Europe, and importing some of those to North America to use to help protect cattle and sheep, because they have worked with wolves. They have been selected to particularly be able to be effective against wolf depredation. Well, so there's a lot going on there.
I know I live in Texas, and I know there are a lot of people who have donkeys to protect them against coyotes, but I don't think a donkey could take on a wolf pack.
Well, I had a couple of donkeys for a while, and I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to mess with them. And if I was a wolf, I know that if I got kicked by a donkey, I would not be feeling very well. So I think they would be effective, and they have been used. We had one small group of wolves here in north central Colorado, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the state wildlife agency, brought a couple of wild donkeys or burros that they brought to that ranch in order to help protect them. They didn't work that great according to the producer, but they can be effective against wolves. They're just, like I say, they are not an animal you want to mess with. And I watched one of my own burros kick out with 90 degrees, not to the rear, but to the side, when a dog was just kind of pestering him. And that was pretty shocking in a way, and was informative.
So let's talk about the Americas. Let's focus on the Americas here. So has there been historically, since like the 1600s, let's say the rise of the Hudson's Bay Company, that kind of thing, has there been a difference between Canadian, American, Mexican policy towards wolves? And the wolves never made it to South America. Is that so, either of you?
That's correct. Go ahead, Chris. Why don't you answer?
I can't speak to the nuances between the three policies, and I'm sure they have been dynamic over time. My focus has been primarily the American Rockies and Mexico. I think a lot of the attitudes prevail, and again, I'm speaking mostly between Mexico and the USA, where wolves are beloved by some and vilified by others, and policies reflect those opinions over time. I can't speak too much about Canadian policy towards wolves. Gary may be able to speak to that, but I do want to come back to what you were talking about earlier. I think there's this argument, especially prevailing nowadays, that that wolf restoration in the American West is this total anomaly. And, how on earth are we going to figure out how to live with these animals? It's never been done before. It's impossible to do. And again, going back to what we were speaking about, Romania has 2,500 wolves and 20 million people in a country that's smaller than Colorado. Italy has over 2,000 wolves and 60 million people in a country that's just slightly larger than Colorado. Bulgaria, Greece, all of these places have a lot of wolves and a lot of people and small land masses. And so this notion that we have to learn to live with wolves, I think, needs to be reframed as we need to relearn how to live with wolves in kind of our modern capacity. So I just wanted to follow up on that part of the conversation. And then, if Gary, if you have any insights into Canadian policies on wolves, I'd welcome them.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I don't have any particular knowledge of that. I guess just sort of observationally, you can look and there have always been wolves in Canada. So for whatever reason, they had the same tools we had. They may have had fewer people or had fewer government programs to go out and destroy wolves. So those are just speculations on my part. I can't really say that I know that, but just given the fact that we've had them, and you can look to Alaska. I mean, wolves were never extirpated from Alaska, partly because it's such a big area, and there weren't the number of people or the number of conflicts that potentially there were further south. So I think it's kind of a spectrum of policy and the belief that of how effective it would be to try to remove wolves. And in a lot of cases, there weren't that many problems, and that's why there weren't removal programs that were as effective as we did in the lower 48.
So to stick with the lower 48, in the contiguous U.S., what was the low ebb for the wolf? Was it the 1800s? Was it the early 1900s? Was it the mid 20th century? And when and what kicked off this turnabout, this idea that wolves need to be good? Because I remember watching probably 15, 20 years ago, early part of this century, on PBS, a documentary. I forget the name of it, but it's quite famous, that showed the Yellowstone experience of by reintroducing wolves, they killed more deer, which led to more habitat growth around rivers, which led to more fish species coming back upriver, et cetera, et cetera. What was the nadir? What was the turnaround, and what have been the results here in the U.S. at least?
I'll take a first stab. I think in different areas of the country there were probably different nadirs, but the mid 20th century is when the last Mexican wolves were killed in the wilds of the United States, until they happened to find a couple more roaming around. And I believe, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last wolf in Colorado was killed in 1945 or so. And I think those, that era represents the height of the success of the kind of wolf extermination campaign in the American West. And shortly thereafter, in conjunction with the civil rights movement, was the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, and we see the advent of the Endangered Species Act. And from a policy perspective, that is kind of what turns the tide. I believe the Endangered Species Act was signed into law in 1973, and Mexican wolves are added to that list in 1976. And we have this very rapid pivot between, private and government-sponsored trappers and hunters killing wolves, to literally the U.S. federal government paying a known wolf trapper to go and live trap wolves to begin their restoration. And so, I think that comes again with this kind of awakening of a greater sense of our connection to the ecosystem, and a pondering of what we're doing to it and how we're impacting it for the future. So I would point to that as both the nadir and the tipping point, although I can't speak to every state in particular.
Gary?
Yeah, I think Chris hit that pretty well. I would say that while you could look at it as the absolute low point in numbers of wolves, it was in the mid 20th century. functionally, wolves were extinct before that, by about the turn of the century, by about 1900. And by that, I mean there were very few packs left. They weren't affecting their prey, which meant they weren't affecting the ecosystem in any way. So they were functionally gone even 50 years before the last wolf, so to speak, was gone. So that's something to, we did a lot before, even before the mid part of the century. And one of the things we developed along the way was poison, which was the most effective tool really in removing wolves. And that was done in multiple ways that poison was used. Classic being to, if you have a dead horse or a dead cow, you lace it with strychnine, and strychnine was a particularly terrible way to die. And wolves you'd have wolves within 100 yards of the carcasses after they ingested some strychnine that would just die. So that was the way we effectively removed them. And so, anytime somebody talks about, well, if we get wolves back, we're never going to be able to control them. We absolutely eliminated wolves with 19th century technology, a minimum of 20th century, early 20th. So we have the ability to do it again if we ever wanted to, or if that was the attempt. So, like I say, there was a functional extinction as well as an actual extinction. And in spite of all that, and in spite of the turnaround, as Chris mentioned, with the Endangered Species Act and just the general environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, there's still a lot of those attitudes out there, and Colorado is demonstrating that very clearly. There are people in Colorado, particularly in the more rural areas, who are people who are concerned about the possible impacts on livestock and on wildlife species, who have those same attitudes. That again, just to characterize it, the only dead wolf or only good wolf is a dead wolf. There's still plenty of people who believe that.
Well,
and
hasn't the example of Yellowstone and maybe some other areas where this was shown that wolves have an overall positive impact, doesn't that sway them, or do they think this is just bullshit?
I think you said it exactly right. That's what they feel. And yeah, and Chris and I have been dealing with this for the last 3 or 4 years, really, with getting the proposition passed that requires the reintroduction of wolves to Colorado. The misinformation is constant, and people will not accept. For example, one of the important facts to know is that there are more elk in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming now than there were when wolves were reintroduced. And that's not because of wolves. It's not that wolves caused an increase in elk populations, but what it is management with wolves on the landscape can still produce as many or more elk than we had before that. So, but those facts do not sway anyone that is absolutely opposed to the idea of wolves. They feel that those are not facts. They can point to the guy that they know who lives in Bozeman, Montana, who says that there are fewer elk around, and that's what they base their opinions on. So it's facts don't seem to matter, honestly.
And I would complicate that a little bit. I think Gary is largely right that facts don't seem to matter and they can't outweigh the vilification of wolves. There are some people who say, okay, well, that's just Yellowstone. Yellowstone is an anomaly. Yellowstone is this rugged, protected national park, and wolves are okay there, but as soon as they leave the park, they're fair game because they become a nuisance as soon as they begin interacting with people and livestock. And again, I think that speaks to this kind of prevailing notion that if we kind of sequester the wild into these little corners that we can look at through binoculars, that's adequate. And that's how we need to protect, wildlife and ecosystems. And the reality is, we rely on these ecosystems, whether they're in Yellowstone or in your backyard outside of Durango. And so I think that argument is disingenuous, but another way to kind of push off the science and facts that studies have shown, in terms of the positive ecosystem benefits of wolves.
So it seems to me then it's again a money issue, a financial issue for a lot of these people. When I emailed you and emailed other people, a lot of people would say that there's not an really impact with wolves in the global warming issue. But it would seem to me that if the livestock community, the big beef, if you want to call it, if they had their way, there would be no wolves. But uh, we know, for example, that it's a lot more economically feasible to use land to farm we're doing cultured meat now. Scientists are doing that. If 50 or 100 years from now, there isn't that economic incentive to protect the wildlife so we can make money, it would seem to me that that would augur something that wolves would be more welcome in the future. Does that sound right, or is that just pie in the sky? Either one of you.
I can take a first shot, Chris. I don't know that I would put it that wolves would be more welcome. I guess they would just be less feared and um, there would be less concern about them. Because yeah, the concerns that livestock producers and outfitters and hunters have are at least logically reasonable. You know, I mean, wolves do kill livestock occasionally, and they live on wildlife. And you know, people take a very simple approach to it that if a wolf kills an elk, that's an elk that a hunter can't kill. And it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that. But that is the attitude. So as long as there are people that continue to view the world that way, which they will, because again, it's logically simplistic, but even though it's incorrect, it's logically consistent and simple to understand. So I think there will always be opposition, just as there are now. I mean, there are people who still hate hawks, you know, that are really having no negative impact on anything. In fact, they're having a positive impact by removing rodents, for example. But there's still people who hate hawks because they're a predator. And that's what it boils down to in a lot of cases. They're simply a predator, and predators are viewed as inherently bad. And the wildlife profession promoted that idea for a long time.
But so, isn't man the ultimate predator? I mean, we've conquered the planet, basically. Chris, let me then ask you, if we're talking about negative impact, it would seem to me, from everything I've read, that we know empirically, whether it's in South America, in the Pampas, whether it's in North America, cattle, or wherever, that livestock have an outsized negative impact on the climate and upon the world, far in excess of any wolves could ever have. Is that not so?
That is certainly my opinion, and I think that that's pretty well backed up by science and data. You know, there was just an article, I don't know if it was today or tomorrow, about the effects of growing alfalfa for livestock on the Colorado River, which we know is, you know, lowering as we speak. You know, methane is an issue. I can provide a dozen anecdotal evidences of driving around the desert Southwest and seeing fences where on one side of the fence there's cattle and the grass is denuded and there's, you know, rivers are trampled, and on the other side of the fence there's not cattle, and it's a totally different world. So, you know, I certainly think that cattle have an incredible negative impact on the environment, especially in the American West, where cattle are not native to. It's a very harsh climate in terms of weather, water, all those kinds of things. So yeah, I certainly believe that. And then just to get back to, you know, your initial question for Gary, if the economic issue went away, let's say, would wolves be welcome with open arms? Last week, there were something like 19,000 cows burned in a factory in Texas. And I don't mean to make light of that story. I mean, that's a horrific story. It would take wolves hundreds, if not thousands of years in Colorado to kill that many cattle. And yet the energy to prevent wolves from returning to Colorado is, you know, incredible compared to the energy to promote this issue of this factory farm burning. And so again, going back to what Gary says, as long as wolves occupy this place in the psyche, data and economics and science don't always matter, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was going to just pick up on that because Gary had mentioned the fear or the hatred for, you know, hawks. Or was it falcons? But that they were predators. And I'm wondering, other than the, you know, immediate economic impact, I'm wondering if a lot of this resistance, especially in the West, does go back to this idea of a natal human fear of the big bad wolf, or you know, you can look online, you can see all kinds of things about. I was just seeing something the other day about giant eagles in, or giant, yeah, I think giant eagles in New Zealand, or maybe it was Australia, and how that impacted the native populations there, where they had this outdated fear of a giant bird coming and swooping their child away. Um, do you think there's anything to that other than the economic issues, that there still is this inner child that we have, that it's the big bad wolf, Little Red Riding Hood and grandma's clothes and all that? Chris, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, I think that certainly exists. And you've mentioned it 3 or 4 times. The most famous wolf is the big bad wolf. And that isn't, that is a pure fairy tale, an anecdote, but we cling to it as though it's driven by science and fact. And again, that's not to dismiss that wolves do kill livestock, and in Europe they have killed people, but it certainly leads to this outsized representation. The other thing, and you just kind of made me think about this, but we are talking earlier about different ecosystem species. The other animals in the American West that have been vilified, not nearly to the extent of wolves, but they include beavers and they include prairie dogs. And neither of those animals are particularly scary, but they're animals that impact the landscape on a scale closer to humans than any other animal. And so I do wonder about, our lack of control represented by those animals over the landscape, and our kind of innate drive to wrest control over nature, and suppressing those other species which are cute and furry and have never killed people is, I think, signals a little bit of that as well.
And yet, one of the most destructive species is the house cats that we have that get out, feral cats, in terms of bird population. But Gary, do you have a comment to follow up on Chris?
Well, I just think that the reality is that it's both of those things that play, and it just depends on the individual which one, whether it's fear or economics or both, and what those combinations are. I mean, beavers, for example, if they flood your road, you have an economic problem. You have to find a way to fix your road, and there's nothing desirable about that. And prairie dogs can damage crops. So there are a lot of reasons why people do have it from the economic perspective. But part of what happens with prairie dogs, for example, is on the fear side of it, is a fear about plague, because prairie dogs will carry plague, but the reality is that prairie dogs die quicker from plague than just about anything. So they really don't, they're not a good reservoir for plague. And a plague, of course, is a non-native organism. It was imported from Europe or from Asia. And so prairie dogs had no resistance. So prairie dogs just totally get wiped out by plague. So, but that does have that fear factor that then goes towards people. And people have died from contracting plague from, most commonly, it's been from house cats who visit an infected prairie dog colony, come in and transmit it to humans. So you can die from plague from prairie dogs, but it's the prairie dogs are dying along the way. They don't last long with plague. But anyway, the point is that both of those factors, I think, play a very important role, both fear and economics. And again, I keep going back to Dan Flores's book because I think it's just fantastic, and you should read it if you haven't. And just his description of the way we've evolved over time towards any of those species. But it's very clear that economics, in his opinion, were the driving factor. Fear was more of an ancillary factor that helped to, and with wolves, fear was a bigger factor than it was, say, with bison. Bison was almost entirely economics, whereas wolves were almost entirely fear, although there was the economic factor of protecting livestock. So it's again, a spectrum of kind of how those two main factors fit together. But they're both there, and they're going to continue to be there.
So just to wrap up here, a couple more questions. What are the major lessons that we've learned from history? Are we changing our approach in general towards wolves? And if so, is it going to lead to a better future, do you think, Chris?
I think yes is the first answer. There are more wolves in North America today than there were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, even probably 100 years ago, although I'd have to check the math on that. So yeah, that is evidence that we are changing. However, I would further complicate that. We are seeing a backlash to that change, especially in the Northern Rockies states. Idaho, Montana, Wyoming are all going down the road of what I would call a war on wolves, where they are killing as many wolves as possible, or at least facilitating the killing of as many wolves as possible. So we have changed. And I think Colorado really represents the most progress on that front in terms of how we perceive wolves and our relationship to them, and a populace literally voting to bring them back. However, the things going on in the Northern Rockies, I think, are a check to that optimism. And we're kind of in a moment where we see one state wanting to bring wolves back. We see other states trying to decimate their wolf populations. And so there's a question mark after my yes.
How about you, Gary?
Yeah, I think that's all correct. And, the one thing that I often go back to is I spent 25 years working for the State Wildlife Agency, and almost all of that career was focused on non-traditional aspects of wildlife management. So not hunting and fishing, but more protection of special status species, as we tended to call them, whether threatened, endangered, or just non-game species in general, which don't have the same funding sources that game animals do, and don't get as much attention as game animals do. So I can look at that and say, yeah, that is still the case, but I also can look at it and say things have changed, and they have. There's no question that we're much more cognizant of those animals, about the concerns for those species of wildlife than we were 30 years ago, and even more so than 100 years ago. And it's a little bit almost embarrassing to look back to what Aldo Leopold had to say back in 1930, and his view of the natural world and of predators and of wildlife management in general, because we haven't caught up to Aldo Leopold yet. Some of us have and some of us haven't, but more of us have than were 30 years ago. So I see a very positive trend. And as Chris noted, here in Colorado, we have a different demography than we have in the Northern Rockies states. So we are going to be more accepting, or finding wolves more desirable, just wolves as one example, and other species of wildlife. So we're moving in the right direction. There's no question about that. We have moved in the right direction, and I'm hopeful that we will continue to do that. As Chris said, the experience in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming is, does put a check on enthusiasm or on optimism, but we do have a different situation here, and I expect that that's going to continue to move in that direction.
So you're more sanguine. I'm sorry, Gary. You're more sanguine about the future of wolves, say in 2100.
Yes, yeah, I think we're going to continue to move in a direction that is more accepting of the natural world in general, and more of an understanding of the role that large predators like wolves have in their systems. That's one of the things we didn't really talk about specifically, but we know across the entire spectrum of things from abalone to elk, the predators are an important part of maintaining systems. And those predators are different predators in those systems if they perform very important functions. And so, we know that, and people are starting to understand that more, or at least get that concept in their heads than they did before. Because again, from a very simplistic, logical standpoint, if a predator is killing something, that means it's something that's taken away from me. That's the attitude that a lot of people have, and it's not that simple. And in fact, there is a very, very important function to that predation.
Chris, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think what Gary was just saying is spot on, in that there is change, and I would go so far as to say there's scientific data, social scientific data to back that up. I mean, there was a survey a couple of years ago of how Americans feel about wildlife, what our values are towards wildlife, and increasingly, we see wildlife as an extended part of our social network, drifting away from what is called a traditional view, which is wildlife is there for us to use. And so I actually suspect, even in the northern Rockies states where there is this ongoing war on wolves, wildlife values are not aligned with those policies as much as we would be led to believe. So, you know, I think Gary's right. We are changing not only from a policy standpoint, but people's attitudes are changing. And I think a lot of that is because of what Gary was just talking about. We understand now the roles that these animals play and our reliance on them.
So you're more sanguine too of the situation in 2100 because humans may change their view from being masters of the planet to stewards of the planet.
Yeah, I think there's no other option. I mean, with whether it's 2100 or 2500, if we don't change that that view from masters to stewards, we're not going to be here that long. I mean, there's just, in my opinion, there's no other outcome.
Well, I want to thank both Chris and Gary. I will link to San Juan Citizens Alliance and Wild Earth Guardians websites. Thank you for a good conversation.
Thank you, Dan.
Hey, Dan,
Okay.
you take care.